The teacup shattered against the marble floor before Alara Whitmore could even breathe, and every head in the drawing room turned toward her at once. "There she goes again," said her Aunt Margaret, not bothering to lower her voice. "Clumsy as ever." Alara knelt quickly, gathering the broken pieces with trembling fingers, her cheeks burning hot. It was only 3 days before her sister Serafina's wedding, and the house was already full of relatives who had come early to help with preparations. Every one of them seemed to have an opinion about Alara, and none of those opinions were kind. "Leave it," her mother, Lady Whitmore, said sharply. "A maid will clean it. Just go, and sit somewhere quiet before you break something else." Alara stood, her hands still shaking, and walked out of the room without a word. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. It was easier to disappear, to fold herself into corners and hallways where no one would notice her at all. Outside, the late afternoon sun spilled across the gardens of Whitmore Hall, turning the roses a deep shade of gold. Alara sat on the stone bench near the old oak tree, the same bench she had been sitting on since she was a little girl, whenever the house became too loud with laughter that was not meant for her. She was 21 years old, the younger of 2 daughters, and for as long as she could remember, she had lived in the shadow of her sister. Serafina was graceful, beautiful, and charming in every way that mattered to their mother. Alara was tall where Serafina was delicate, quiet where Serafina was lively, and forever tripping over rugs, dropping cups, and saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment. It had not always felt like a fault. As a child, Alara had simply been curious about the world, more interested in books and drawings than in learning how to curtsy properly or how to laugh at a joke that was not funny. But over the years, her family had turned her differences into something shameful. She had heard the word graceless so many times that it had begun to feel like her real name. She opened the small leather notebook she carried everywhere and looked at her latest sketch, a drawing of a bird she had seen resting on the garden wall that morning. It was not perfect, but it was honest, and there was something comforting in that. Drawing was the one thing no one could mock her for, mostly because no one ever looked closely enough to see what she had made. "There you are," came a voice from the garden path. It was Serafina, dressed in a soft blue morning gown, her golden hair pinned up in loose curls. She looked, as always, like something out of a painting. "I was just getting some air," Alara said, closing her notebook. Serafina sat beside her, smoothing her skirts. "Mother is furious about the teacup. It was part of the good set, you know, the one meant for the wedding breakfast." "I know. I am sorry." "You are always sorry," Serafina said, though not unkindly. There was something almost sad in her voice, as if she wished her sister could simply learn to be less clumsy, less strange, less herself. "I do wish you would try harder, Alara. In 3 days, half of society will be here. I do not want you to be laughed at." Alara wanted to say that she was laughed at every single day already, in this very house, by their own family. But she said nothing. It was easier that way. "Try to be careful during the wedding," Serafina continued. "Please, for me." "I will try," Alara said quietly, though she already knew that trying rarely made a difference. Her body simply did not move the way other people's bodies moved. Her feet caught on things that were not there. Her hands trembled when she felt watched, which made her drop things even more. The harder she tried to be graceful, the worse it seemed to become. Serafina left soon after, called away by their mother to approve flower arrangements, and Alara remained alone in the garden until the sky began to turn orange. She thought about the wedding, about the crowd of strangers who would fill the hall, about the whispers that always seemed to follow her wherever she went. She thought, too, about the years ahead, when Serafina would be married and gone, and Alara would remain at Whitmore Hall, unmarried, unwanted, a burden to a family that had already decided she would never be anything more than an embarrassment. It was not a comfortable thought, but it was a familiar one. That evening, dinner was a tense affair. The long table was crowded with relatives who had traveled from all corners of the country, each one eager to discuss the upcoming wedding in great detail. Alara sat near the end of the table, half listening, half lost in her own thoughts, until her cousin Beatrice leaned toward her with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I do hope you have a proper gown for the wedding," Beatrice said. "Something that fits well. We would not want any accidents in front of the guests." Laughter rippled around the table, soft but unmistakable. Elara felt her face grow warm again, but she kept her eyes on her plate. "I am sure Elara will manage," her mother said, though her tone suggested she was not sure at all. "She always finds a way to surprise us." More laughter. Elara excused herself before dessert was served, claiming a headache, and retreated to her room at the top of the house. It was small compared to Serafina's, tucked beneath the eaves, with a single window that looked out over the fields beyond the estate. She lit a candle and sat at her desk, opening her notebook again, letting her pencil move across the page without thinking too much about where it went. Drawing had always been her escape. When the world felt too loud, too cruel, too full of people who saw only her mistakes, she could lose herself in lines and shadows, in the quiet act of creating something that belonged entirely to her. Tonight she drew the garden, the old oak tree, the bench where she had sat that afternoon. She did not draw herself into the picture. She rarely did. A knock came at her door, soft and hesitant. It was her father, Lord Whitmore, a quiet man who spoke rarely but watched everything. "May I come in?" he asked. Elara nodded, and he stepped inside, glancing at the drawing on her desk before meeting her eyes. "Your mother mentioned the teacup," he said. "I know. I will pay for a new one, if that would help." He shook his head slightly. "That is not why I came." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, as he always did. "I know this house has not always been kind to you, Elara. I see it, even if I do not always say so." She looked at him, surprised. It was rare for anyone in her family to acknowledge what she felt, let alone her father, who so often seemed lost in his own quiet world of ledgers and correspondence. "You are not what your mother wished for," he continued, "but you are not less because of it. Whatever anyone says at the wedding, remember that." It was such a small thing, such a simple sentence, but it settled something warm and quiet inside her chest. She thanked him, and he nodded once before leaving her alone again with her candle and her notebook. That night, Elara lay awake for a long while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the house settling around her. She thought about the wedding, about the crowd of eyes that would follow her every movement, about the whispers that would surely find her no matter how carefully she tried to disappear into the background. She thought, too, about something else, something she rarely allowed herself to consider. What if, just once, someone looked at her and saw something other than a mistake waiting to happen? It was a foolish thought, she told herself, the kind of thought that led only to disappointment. And yet it lingered, quiet and stubborn, long after she finally closed her eyes. The next morning brought more chaos. Seamstresses arrived to fit the wedding gowns. Florists filled the halls with the scent of roses and lilies, and messengers came and went with letters confirming the arrival of guests from every corner of the country. Whitmore Hall, usually quiet and a little worn at the edges, had transformed into something grand and busy, almost unrecognizable. Elara spent the morning helping where she could, carrying boxes of ribbon, arranging chairs in the ballroom, doing her best to stay out of everyone's way. She was careful, more careful than usual, aware that any misstep would be noticed and remembered. But carefulness had never truly protected her before, and it did not protect her now. While carrying a tray of crystal glasses to the dining room, she caught her heel on the edge of a carpet that had been laid out that morning for the wedding guests. The tray tipped, and though she managed to catch most of the glasses, two slipped free and shattered against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Silence fell over the hallway. Several relatives gathered nearby to discuss seating arrangements turned to look. Aunt Margaret sighed loudly, as if she had expected nothing less. Beatrice covered her mouth to hide a laugh that was not hidden well at all. "I am so sorry," Elara said quickly, already kneeling to gather the pieces. "I will replace them, I promise." "It is quite all right," said a voice from behind her, calm and unbothered. It was her father's cousin, an older woman named Mrs. Fairweather, who had always been kinder to Elara than most of the family. She knelt beside her, helping to gather the broken glass. "Accidents happen to everyone, my dear. Do not let them trouble you so." "They happen to me more than most," Elara said quietly. Mrs. Fairweather smiled gently. "Perhaps, but I have noticed something about you, Elara, that the rest of this family seems to have missed." "What is that?" "You never once complain when they mock you. You simply carry on. That takes more strength than any of them realize." Elara did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded and finished cleaning the glass in silence. It was a small kindness, but it stayed with her for the rest of the day, a quiet reminder that not everyone in the world measured her by her mistakes. By the time evening arrived, Alara was exhausted, both from the physical work of preparing for the wedding and from the constant effort of holding herself together in front of a family that seemed determined to find fault in everything she did. She skipped dinner entirely, choosing instead to walk through the gardens one last time before the wedding madness truly began. The gardens were quiet at that hour, lit only by the soft glow of the setting sun and the first faint stars appearing overhead. Alara walked slowly along the gravel path, letting the cool evening air settle her nerves. Tomorrow the final guests would arrive. In 2 days, her sister would be married, and the house would be filled with strangers, all of them ready to judge her the moment she stumbled. She stopped near the fountain at the center of the garden, watching the water catch the last light of day, and allowed herself a small, private moment of hope. Perhaps this wedding would be different. Perhaps, for once, she would move through the crowd unnoticed, unremarkable, safe. It was a fragile hope, and she knew it. But as she stood there in the quiet garden, she held on to it anyway, unaware that in just 2 days, everything about her carefully guarded, overlooked life was about to change in a way she could never have imagined. Somewhere far beyond Whitmore Hall, in a grand townhouse in London, a letter arrived for a man who rarely accepted invitations of any kind. Julian Ashbourne, the Duke of Ashbourne, read the wedding invitation from Lord Whitmore with little interest, setting it aside among a dozen others he had already declined that season. He had no particular wish to attend a wedding for a family he barely knew, in a part of the country he had no reason to visit. But circumstances, as they so often do, had other plans. The groom, it turned out, was the son of an old friend of his late father, a man to whom the Duke owed a debt of loyalty he could not easily ignore. And so, with a quiet sigh and very little enthusiasm, Julian Ashbourne accepted the invitation, unaware that 2 days from now, in the gardens and ballrooms of a modest country estate, he would meet someone who would change the entire course of his carefully guarded life. Neither of them knew it yet, but the wedding of Seraphina Whitmore was about to become far more than a simple family celebration. It was about to become the beginning of something neither Alara nor the Duke could have predicted, something that would prove, once and for all, that the people who mocked her the loudest understood her the least. The final day before the wedding arrived with a flurry of noise that seemed to shake the very walls of Whitmore Hall. Carriages rolled up the long gravel drive one after another, each carrying guests dressed in their finest clothes, their voices bright with excitement and gossip. Servants rushed between rooms carrying trunks, flowers, and trays of refreshments, while Lady Whitmore stood at the center of it all, directing everyone with the sharp precision of a general preparing for battle. Alara kept to the edges of the chaos, just as she always did. She had been assigned the task of greeting minor guests at the side entrance, a duty her mother considered safe enough not to embarrass the family, since it involved little more than curtsying and offering polite words of welcome. Alara did not mind. It gave her something to focus on, and it kept her away from the more important guests, who would surely notice every flaw in her posture and every awkward pause in her speech. By midday, most of the family had arrived, filling the halls with laughter and conversation that Alara listened to from a distance. She recognized cousins she had not seen in years, aunts and uncles who greeted her with the same tired, polite smiles they always wore, the kind that said they remembered exactly who she was and had already decided what to think of her. "Alara, darling," said Aunt Margaret, sweeping past her in a cloud of perfume. "Do try to stay out of the way tomorrow, won't you? Seraphina has enough to worry about, without an accident spoiling things." "I will do my best," Alara replied, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. She spent the afternoon helping to arrange chairs in the ballroom where the wedding breakfast would be held, working alongside 2 of the household maids who, unlike most of her family, treated her with simple, uncomplicated kindness. They spoke to her about ordinary things, the weather, the flowers, the food that had been prepared for the celebration, and for a little while, Alara felt almost normal. It did not last long. As she carried a stack of folded linens across the room, her cousin Beatrice appeared in the doorway, with 2 other young women Alara did not recognize, all of them dressed in fashionable gowns, clearly meant to impress the guests who would soon fill the estate. "There she is," Beatrice said, loud enough for the newcomers to hear. "This is my cousin Alara." Do be careful near her. She has a talent for breaking things. The two women laughed, a light, careless sound that cut deeper than Alara expected. She kept her eyes on the linens in her arms and said nothing, though her hands tightened around the fabric until her knuckles turned pale. I heard she nearly ruined the good china set, one of the women whispered, not quite quietly enough. It gets worse, Beatrice said. Wait until you see her try to dance. It is truly something to behold. Alara set the linens down carefully on a nearby chair and walked out of the ballroom without a word, her chest tight with the familiar mixture of shame and anger that she had learned, over many years, to swallow rather than express. She made her way to the kitchen gardens at the back of the house, where the noise of the wedding preparations faded into the quiet hum of bees moving between rows of herbs and vegetables. She sat on an overturned crate near the garden wall, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them, a posture she knew was not ladylike, but one that felt, in that moment, like the only thing holding her together. You look as though you could use a moment of peace, came a voice from nearby. Alara looked up, startled, to find Mrs. Fairweather standing at the edge of the garden, a small basket of herbs in her hands. The older woman's presence was, as always, calm and unhurried, a welcome contrast to the frantic energy filling the rest of the house. I am sorry, Alara said, rising quickly. I did not mean to hide away. Sit down, child. There is no shame in needing quiet. Mrs. Fairweather lowered herself onto a nearby bench with a soft sigh, setting her basket beside her. I saw Beatrice and her friends leaving the ballroom. I can guess what happened. Alara said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. You know, Mrs. Fairweather said after a moment, when I was your age, I was considered quite plain, quite awkward. My own sisters used to say I would never find a husband, that I talked too much about books and too little about fashion. She smiled faintly at the memory. It hurt, at the time, more than I ever admitted to anyone. What happened? Alara asked, curious despite herself. I grew older, and I stopped caring quite so much what my sisters thought of me. I married a man who valued exactly the things they mocked, my love of books, my endless questions, my refusal to simply smile and agree with everyone around me. He used to say that the people who cannot see your worth are not the people whose opinions should matter to you. Alara considered this for a long moment, watching the bees move lazily between the lavender stalks. It is difficult, she said finally, to stop caring what people think, when those people are your own family. I know, Mrs. Fairweather said gently. It is one of the hardest things in the world, but you are stronger than you believe, Alara. I have watched you these past few days, and I have seen how much unkindness you carry, without ever once losing your composure. That is not weakness. That is remarkable strength, even if no one else in this house has the wisdom to see it. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, before Mrs. Fairweather rose to return to the house, patting Alara's shoulder gently as she passed. Alara remained in the garden a little longer, letting the words settle over her like a warm blanket against the chill of everything Beatrice had said. That evening, the family gathered for a final dinner before the wedding, a grand affair meant to welcome the most important guests who had traveled from London and beyond. Alara dressed carefully in one of her better gowns, a soft green dress that had belonged to Serafina 2 seasons ago, altered to fit Alara's taller frame. It was not new, and it was not especially fashionable, but it was the best she owned, and she wore it with as much quiet dignity as she could manage. The dining hall glittered with candlelight, the long table set with the family's finest silver and crystal, much of it borrowed or freshly polished for the occasion. Alara found her seat near the middle of the table, close enough to be present, but far enough from the head of the table to avoid too much attention. She had learned, over many years, exactly where to sit, in order to remain as invisible as possible. Conversation flowed easily around her, mostly about the wedding, about the groom's family, about the guests expected to arrive the following morning, including, someone mentioned in passing, a duke who was said to be attending as a favor to an old family friend. Alara listened with mild curiosity, but little real interest. Dukes and their affairs belonged to a world entirely separate from her own quiet, overlooked existence. I do hope the weather holds for tomorrow, Serafina said from her place at the head of the table, glowing with excitement despite the exhaustion visible beneath her eyes. It would be terrible for anything to go wrong. Nothing will go wrong, my dear, their mother said firmly. casting a brief, pointed glance in Ilara's direction. "We have taken every precaution." Ilara felt the weight of that glance settle over her like a stone, but she said nothing, choosing instead to focus on her plate and the quiet comfort of simply getting through the evening without incident. She was careful with her wine glass, careful with her fork, careful with every small movement, aware that any misstep at this table would be remembered and repeated for years to come. Later that night, after the last of the guests had retired to their rooms and the house had finally begun to settle into a rare, exhausted quiet, Ilara found herself unable to sleep. She lay in her bed beneath the eaves, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside her window, her mind circling endlessly around the day ahead. Tomorrow, her sister would be married. Tomorrow, the ballroom would fill with strangers, all of them dressed in their finest clothes, all of them ready to smile politely while whispering unkind things the moment her back was turned. Tomorrow, she would be watched more closely than she had been watched in years, and she knew, with a heavy certainty, that at some point during the celebration, she would stumble, or drop something, or say the wrong thing, and the whispers would begin exactly as they always did. She rose from her bed and lit a candle, pulling her notebook from the desk drawer where she kept it hidden from prying eyes. She turned to a blank page and began to draw, not the garden this time, nor the birds she so often sketched, but a simple figure standing alone at the edge of a grand ballroom, surrounded by shapes that suggested a crowd without giving them any real detail or form. It was, she realized as she worked, a picture of herself, though she had never drawn herself so plainly before. She studied the sketch for a long moment, this lonely figure standing apart from everyone around her, and felt a strange mixture of sadness and quiet acceptance settle over her. Whatever tomorrow brought, she told herself, she would face it as she always had. She would keep her head down, her hands steady, and her heart guarded against the unkindness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. It was not the life she might have wished for, but it was the life she knew, and she had grown skilled, over many years, at surviving it. She closed her notebook, blew out the candle, and finally drifted into a restless sleep, entirely unaware that somewhere on the road leading toward Whitmore Hall, a carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Ashbourne was already making its way through the darkness, carrying a man who had no idea that tomorrow, everything about his carefully ordered life was about to change because of a woman he had not yet met. Julian Ashbourne sat in silence as his carriage rattled along the country road, staring out at the darkened fields passing by. He had attended more weddings than he cared to remember over the years, each one blending into the next, filled with the same empty conversations, the same calculating mothers presenting their daughters for his approval, the same tedious performance of politeness he had long ago grown weary of. He expected nothing different from this wedding. He would offer his congratulations to the groom, endure a few hours of forced conversation, and return to London as quickly as propriety allowed. It was, he told himself, simply another obligation to be fulfilled, another evening to be survived. He could not have known, as his carriage finally turned onto the long drive leading toward Whitmore Hall, that the woman who would occupy his thoughts long after the wedding ended was, at that very moment, lying awake in a small room beneath the eaves, dreaming not of dukes or grand romances, but simply of surviving one more day without becoming, once again, the family's greatest embarrassment. Morning arrived at Whitmore Hall with a golden light that spilled through every window, waking the household to the day everyone had been preparing for. Ilara woke early, before the sun had fully risen, her heart already beating faster than usual. She lay still for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of servants moving through the halls below, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of hurried voices, the unmistakable energy of a house preparing for a celebration. She dressed carefully in the gown chosen for her weeks earlier, a pale lavender dress with simple embroidery along the sleeves. Nothing as fine as Serafina's wedding gown, of course, but respectable enough to avoid comment. She sat at her small mirror and did her best to arrange her dark hair into something neat and presentable, though her hands trembled slightly with nerves, making the task more difficult than it should have been. By the time she made her way downstairs, the house was already alive with activity. Serafina stood in the center of the drawing room, surrounded by their mother, 2 maids, and a dressmaker, making final adjustments to her wedding gown. She looked radiant, her golden hair woven with small white flowers, her gown a shimmering ivory silk, that seemed to catch every ray of morning light. "Ilara," Serafina said, catching sight of her sister in the doorway. "Come here. Tell me honestly, does it look well?" "You look beautiful," Ilara said, and she meant it completely. For a moment, the tension between them softened, and Serafina smiled at her with something close to genuine warmth. "Thank you," Serafina said quietly. "I know today will be difficult for you, with everyone watching. Just try to stay near the back during the ceremony, and you should be fine." It was meant kindly, Ilara understood, but it still stung. This constant reminder that her place at the celebration was to remain small, unnoticed, tucked safely away from the eyes of guests who might otherwise find something to mock. She nodded and said nothing more, retreating to help with the final preparations, before the guests began to arrive in earnest. By late morning, carriages lined the long drive leading to Whitmore Hall, and the ballroom, transformed overnight into a place of quiet elegance, filled with rows of chairs facing a simple altar, decorated with white roses and ribbons. Ilara found her place near the back corner, exactly as her sister had suggested, watching as the room slowly filled with guests dressed in their finest clothes. She recognized many faces from the days before, relatives who had already made their opinions of her quite clear, but there were also strangers, guests from the groom's side of the family, people from London whose names she did not know but whose confident, easy manner marked them immediately as belonging to a world far removed from her own quiet country life. Among them, seated near the front on the groom's side, was a man Ilara noticed almost immediately, though she could not have said exactly why. He was tall, dressed in dark, impeccably tailored clothes that spoke of considerable wealth without any need for excess decoration. His expression, as he waited for the ceremony to begin, was calm and somewhat distant, as though his thoughts were elsewhere entirely, and there was something in his posture, an easy confidence, a quiet authority, that made him stand out among the crowd without any obvious effort on his part. She did not know, of course, that this was Julian Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, though a whispered conversation between two guests nearby soon informed her of exactly who he was. She glanced at him once more before quickly looking away, feeling foolish for her curiosity. Dukes, she reminded herself, existed in a world so far removed from hers that there was little point in wondering about them at all. The ceremony began soon after, and Ilara watched with genuine happiness as her sister walked down the aisle toward her groom, a kind young man named Edmund who had always treated Ilara with simple courtesy, unlike so many others in their circle. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and by the time the ceremony ended, tears of joy had gathered in more than a few eyes throughout the room, including, quietly, in Ilara's own. The wedding breakfast that followed was a grand affair, tables arranged throughout the ballroom and adjoining rooms, laden with food and flowers, the air filled with music and laughter, as guests mingled and celebrated. Ilara moved carefully through the crowd, offering polite greetings where required, but mostly keeping to the edges of the room, exactly as she had been taught to do. It was during this time, as she carried a small plate of food toward a quiet corner where she hoped to eat in peace, that disaster struck exactly as she had feared it would. The hem of her gown caught beneath the leg of a chair positioned slightly too far into the walking path, and before she could catch her balance, she stumbled forward, the plate slipping from her hands and clattering loudly against the polished floor, food scattering in every direction. The room did not fall entirely silent, the music and conversation continued around her, but enough heads turned, enough laughter rippled through the nearby guests, that Ilara felt her face burn with humiliation as she knelt quickly to gather the mess she had made. "Honestly," she heard Aunt Margaret mutter to a nearby guest, not quietly enough, "that girl cannot manage a simple plate of food. I do not know how her mother copes." "I heard she nearly ruined the wedding china earlier this week," another voice added, followed by soft, cruel laughter. Ilara gathered the broken plate and scattered food as quickly as she could, her hands shaking, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall in front of so many witnesses. A servant rushed over to help, murmuring quiet reassurances, but the damage to Ilara's composure had already been done. She rose, mumbled an apology to no one in particular, and made her way toward the edge of the room, desperate for a moment away from the watching eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. She did not notice, in her hurry to escape the humiliation, that across the room, Julian Ashbourne had witnessed the entire incident, and unlike the other guests, he had not laughed. He had been standing near the refreshment table, engaged in polite but uninteresting conversation with the groom's uncle, when the small commotion caught his attention. He watched as the young woman stumbled, watched the plate shatter against the floor, watched the ripple of laughter move through the nearby guests with an ease that suggested this was not the first time such laughter had followed her. What struck him, however, was not the stumble itself, but everything that followed. He watched her kneel quickly, efficiently, gathering the mess with practiced hands that suggested long familiarity with exactly this kind of situation. He watched her rise with quiet dignity, despite the laughter surrounding her. Her chin lifted slightly, even as her cheeks burned red with embarrassment. And he watched, most notably, the flicker of something sharp and intelligent in her eyes, just before she turned away. Something that had nothing to do with clumsiness, and everything to do with a person who had learned, through long practice, exactly how to endure unkindness without allowing it to break her completely. "Who is that young woman?" he asked the groom's uncle, nodding subtly toward the corner where Alara had disappeared. The older man glanced over, following his gaze. "Ah, that would be Alara Whitmore, the bride's younger sister. Sweet girl, I suppose, though rather unfortunate in her manner. Always dropping something or other." Julian said nothing more on the subject, but his gaze remained on the corner where the young woman had vanished for a moment longer than politeness strictly required. There was something about her that lingered in his thoughts, something he could not quite name, and he found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, genuinely curious about a stranger at a wedding he had attended purely out of obligation. Alara, meanwhile, had found refuge in a small alcove just beyond the main ballroom, where a set of glass doors opened onto a quiet terrace overlooking the gardens. She stepped outside, grateful for the cool afternoon air against her flushed cheeks, and allowed herself, finally, a moment of privacy to compose herself. "Are you quite all right?" The voice, calm and unfamiliar, startled her. She turned to find the very man she had noticed earlier standing a respectful distance away, his expression neither mocking nor pitying, but simply, genuinely curious. "I am fine, thank you," she said quickly, straightening her posture and attempting to compose herself despite her flustered state. "I apologize if I disturbed you." "You did not disturb me," he said. "I merely wished to make certain you were not injured." That was quite a fall. Alara felt her cheeks flush again, though for an entirely different reason this time. "I am quite used to falling, Your Grace," she said, the title feeling strange and formal on her tongue. "It happens rather often, I am afraid." "Does it?" he said, though it was not quite a question. He studied her for a moment, longer than was strictly polite, and Alara found herself unable to look away, caught by the quiet, unreadable expression in his dark eyes. "I noticed you gathered the broken plate rather quickly. Most people, in my experience, tend to freeze in such moments, embarrassed beyond movement. You did not." "I have had a great deal of practice," Alara said, unsure why she was being so honest with a man she had only just met. "It is easier to simply clean up the mess and move on than to stand there while everyone stares." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of what might have been admiration, though Alara could not be certain. "That seems a wise philosophy," he said, far wiser than most of the guests inside seemed to possess. Alara did not know how to respond to that. No one, in her experience, had ever suggested that her way of handling humiliation was wise. Mostly, people simply told her not to be clumsy in the first place, as though clumsiness were something she could simply choose to abandon if only she tried harder. "I should return inside," she said finally, uncertain what else to say. Uncertain, too, why her heart was beating so quickly beneath her borrowed lavender gown. "My sister will be looking for me." "Of course," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. But as she moved by him toward the glass doors, he spoke again, his voice quiet but clear. "For what it is worth, Miss Whitmore, I did not find the incident amusing in the least. I found it rather more interesting than anything else that has happened at this wedding so far." Alara paused, glancing back at him, uncertain how to interpret such an unusual statement. But before she could think of a reply, Beatrice appeared at the terrace doors, calling her name with obvious curiosity, and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had begun. She returned to the ballroom in something of a daze, Beatrice peppering her with questions about the handsome stranger she had apparently been speaking with. Questions Alara answered vaguely, still trying to understand exactly what had just occurred. No one had ever spoken to her the way that man had spoken to her, without pity, without mockery, but with something that felt remarkably like genuine interest. She told herself, firmly, that it meant nothing. He was a duke, a man from a world entirely separate from her own, likely making polite conversation out of simple courtesy, before forgetting her existence entirely, by the time his carriage departed. It was foolish, she reminded herself, to read anything more into a few kind words exchanged on a quiet terrace. And yet, for the rest of the afternoon, as she moved carefully through the celebration, avoiding chairs and carpets and anything else that might cause her to stumble again, she found her eyes drifting occasionally toward the tall figure standing near the center of the room, and more than once, she found his gaze already resting on her, quiet and thoughtful, as though he too could not quite stop himself from looking. Neither of them spoke of it again that day, but something had shifted nonetheless, something small and quiet, like the first crack of light appearing beneath a door that had been closed for a very long time. The wedding breakfast stretched long into the afternoon, and as the hours passed, Elara found herself increasingly aware of the tall figure who seemed, quite improbably, to keep appearing wherever she happened to be standing. She told herself it was coincidence, nothing more, the natural result of a large celebration where guests moved freely between rooms. But by the third such encounter, she had begun to suspect that coincidence had very little to do with it. She was standing near the edge of the ballroom, watching the musicians tune their instruments for the dancing that would soon begin, when Julian Ashbourne appeared beside her once again, this time with 2 glasses of lemonade in his hands. "I thought you might be thirsty," he said, offering one of the glasses. Given the exertion of this afternoon, Elara accepted the glass, though her fingers trembled slightly as she did, still unused to being addressed so directly by anyone, let alone a duke. "That is very kind of you, Your Grace, though I hope you are not simply making conversation out of pity." "Pity," he repeated, as though testing the word and finding it entirely inadequate. "I assure you, Miss Whitmore, pity has very little to do with why I am standing here." "Then why are you standing here?" she asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. He considered the question seriously, as though it deserved a careful answer rather than an easy dismissal. "Because," he said finally, "in a room full of people performing politeness, you seem to be the only person who has not once pretended to be something she is not. I find that rather refreshing." Elara did not know how to respond to such an observation, so she simply sipped her lemonade and looked out over the crowded ballroom, watching couples begin to gather for the first dance of the celebration. "Most people would say I am simply awkward," she said quietly. "Not honest. Awkward. Perhaps those are not so very different," he said. "Awkwardness, in my experience, is often simply honesty that has not yet learned to disguise itself in pleasant manners." She glanced at him, startled by the perceptiveness of the remark. "That is a rather generous way of viewing my many mishaps, Your Grace. I have found," he said, "that generosity of thought is rarely wasted, even when it is not deserved. Though in your case, I suspect it is entirely deserved." Before Elara could respond, her mother appeared at her side, her expression a careful mixture of surprise and calculation as she took in the sight of her daughter speaking so easily with the Duke of Ashbourne. "Your Grace," Lady Whitmore said, dropping into a deep curtsy, "what an honor it is to have you at our humble celebration." "The honor is mine, Lady Whitmore," Julian said smoothly, though Elara noticed a subtle shift in his manner, a polite formality, replacing the easy warmth he had shown moments before. "Your daughter and I were simply discussing the merits of honesty over politeness." Lady Whitmore's smile faltered slightly, clearly uncertain how to interpret such a statement. "I do hope Elara has not been troubling you with her chatter, Your Grace. She can be rather awkward in company." "On the contrary," Julian said, his tone perfectly pleasant but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I have found your daughter's company far more interesting than most conversations I have endured today." Elara watched her mother's expression shift from confusion to something closer to calculation, the sudden realization dawning that perhaps her overlooked younger daughter possessed some unexpected value after all. It was not a comfortable thing to witness, this immediate shift from dismissal to interest, motivated entirely by the presence of a duke rather than any genuine change of heart. "Well," Lady Whitmore said, recovering quickly, "Elara has always had her own particular charms, once one comes to know her properly." Elara nearly laughed at the sudden reversal, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. It was, she realized, Exactly the kind of moment she had always dreaded, the family's opinion of her shifting, not because of anything she had done, but simply because someone important had shown her a moment of kindness. The musicians began to play in earnest, signaling the start of the dancing, and Lady Whitmore excused herself quickly, no doubt eager to spread word of the Duke's interest throughout the gathered relatives, before the evening progressed much further. Alara watched her go with a mixture of amusement and weariness, already anticipating the whispered conversations that would follow. "Your mother seems rather surprised by our conversation," Julian observed once she had gone. "My mother is rarely surprised by anything that might prove useful to the family," Alara said, then immediately flushed at her own boldness, embarrassed by how easily the words had slipped out. "I apologize, that was unkind. It was honest," Julian said. "I told you, I find honesty far more interesting than politeness." The musicians shifted into a lively country dance, and couples began forming lines across the ballroom floor. Alara watched with a familiar tightening in her chest, the certain knowledge that she would not be joining them, not after the disaster with the plate earlier in the day, not with so many watchful eyes already prepared to laugh at her first misstep. "You are not dancing," Julian observed, following her gaze toward the forming lines. "I do not dance," she said simply. "Or rather, I dance badly enough that it is kinder to everyone involved if I simply do not attempt it." "That seems a great shame," he said. "Dancing done poorly is still infinitely more interesting than standing still and doing nothing at all." "Easy for you to say, Your Grace. I doubt anyone has ever laughed at you for missing a step." "On the contrary," he said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time since she had met him. "I was a rather terrible dancer as a young man. My tutor despaired of me entirely, for the better part of 2 years." Alara looked at him with open skepticism. "I find that difficult to believe." "It is entirely true. Ask my sister, if you ever have the misfortune of meeting her. She still tells the story of the time I stepped on her foot so thoroughly during a ball that she was forced to limp for the remainder of the evening." Despite herself, Alara laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine, the first such laugh she had allowed herself in the presence of anyone outside her closest confidants. "I cannot imagine you stepping on anyone's foot, Your Grace. You seem far too composed for such clumsiness." "Composure, Miss Whitmore, is simply practice disguised as talent. I promise you, I was every bit as awkward as you claim to be. Once. The only difference is that no one mocked me for it, because I happened to be born a duke, and dukes are rarely mocked for anything, regardless of how deserved the mockery might be." There was something quietly bitter in his tone as he said this, and Alara found herself curious about the life that lay behind such a statement, the loneliness that might exist even within the privilege of a title as grand as his own. But before she could ask anything further, the dance concluded, and a new set of couples began forming for the next. "Would you do me the honor of a walk in the gardens instead?" Julian asked. "I find I have had quite enough of dancing in crowded ballrooms for one afternoon." Alara hesitated, aware of the many eyes that would surely notice such a request, aware, too, of what her family would say, once they discovered she had spent even more time in the company of the Duke of Ashbourne. But something in his quiet, genuine expression made her set aside her usual caution. "I would like that very much, Your Grace," she said. They stepped out through the same terrace doors where they had first spoken, moving into the cool afternoon air of the gardens beyond the ballroom, the sound of music and laughter fading gradually behind them, as they walked along the gravel path lined with roses and late summer blooms. "Tell me," Julian said as they walked, "what is it that you actually enjoy, Miss Whitmore, when you are not being mocked by your relatives or dropping plates of food in crowded ballrooms?" Alara considered the question carefully, unused to being asked about her own interests by anyone, let alone with such genuine curiosity. "I draw," she said finally. "Sketches, mostly. Birds, gardens, small things that most people never bother to notice. May I see one of your drawings sometime?" "They are not especially good," she said, though a small part of her felt pleased by the request. "I have never shown them to anyone outside my family." "All the more reason I should like to see them," he said. "I have grown rather tired of things that are polished and perfect and utterly without character. I suspect your drawings possess a great deal more honesty than most of the paintings hanging in my own gallery, created by artists paid handsomely to flatter their subjects." They continued walking, the conversation flowing more easily than Alara could have imagined possible with a man she had met only hours earlier. She told him, hesitantly at first and then with growing confidence, about the small joys she found in quiet moments, the books she loved, the birds she watched from her window each morning, the strange comfort she found in gardens when the house grew too loud with unkindness. He listened with a genuine attentiveness that she had never before experienced from anyone, asking thoughtful questions, offering observations of his own that suggested a mind far more curious and reflective than she would have expected from a man of his position. By the time they returned to the edge of the gardens, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, Alara felt something she had rarely felt in her own life, the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. "I should return to the celebration," she said reluctantly, as they approached the terrace doors once more. "My absence will surely be noticed." "Of course," Julian said, though something in his expression suggested equal reluctance to end their conversation. "Might I request the pleasure of your company again before the evening concludes, Miss Whitmore?" "I would like that," Alara said softly. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she walked back into a crowded room without dreading the eyes that might follow her. She did not notice, as she stepped back into the ballroom, the small cluster of relatives gathered near the refreshment table, watching her return with the Duke's gaze lingering after her, whispering among themselves with an urgency that suggested the entire family had already begun reconsidering everything they thought they knew about their overlooked, graceless Alara. By the time evening settled over Whitmore Hall, the wedding celebration had reached its peak, the ballroom glowing with candlelight and filled with the sound of music, laughter, and the constant murmur of conversation. Alara moved through the remainder of the evening in a strange, quiet daze, her mind still turning over every word she had exchanged with Julian Ashbourne in the gardens, unable to fully believe that such a conversation had actually taken place. Word of their walk together had, predictably, spread through the gathered relatives with remarkable speed. Alara noticed the shift almost immediately upon returning to the ballroom, the way conversations paused when she passed, the way eyes followed her with newfound curiosity, rather than the familiar dismissiveness she had grown so used to. "I simply cannot believe it," Beatrice said, appearing at her side with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and thinly veiled jealousy. "The Duke of Ashbourne, walking with you in the gardens. Whatever did you say to him?" "We simply talked," Alara said, unwilling to share the details of a conversation that had felt, to her, deeply private and personal. "It was nothing so remarkable as you seem to think." "Nothing remarkable," Beatrice repeated, her tone sharpening slightly. "Alara, the man barely speaks to anyone at these gatherings. Everyone says he finds most society tedious beyond endurance. Yet he spent nearly an hour walking with you." Alara said nothing further, uncertain how to explain something she barely understood herself. She excused herself from the conversation and made her way toward a quiet corner of the ballroom, hoping for a brief moment of peace before the evening's festivities continued. Her mother found her there, only minutes later, her expression carrying none of the dismissiveness Alara had grown accustomed to over the years. "Alara," Lady Whitmore said, her voice unusually soft, "you must tell me everything. What did the Duke say to you? Did he speak of his intentions?" "His intentions?" Alara repeated, startled by the question. "Mother, we simply walked in the gardens and spoke of ordinary things. There were no intentions to speak of." "A duke does not simply walk in the gardens with a young woman for no reason," her mother said, a familiar calculating gleam appearing in her eyes, the very same gleam Alara had seen countless times when her mother discussed advantageous matches for Serafina. "This could be an extraordinary opportunity, Alara. You must be careful not to squander it." "I am not attempting to secure anything from him, Mother," Alara said, feeling a flare of frustration rise within her. "He simply spoke to me, as though I were a person worth speaking to. That is all." Her mother's expression shifted, something almost apologetic crossing her features for a brief moment, though it vanished quickly beneath renewed calculation. "Of course, dear, of course. Though you must admit, it would change a great deal for this family, if such attention were to continue." Alara turned away without responding, her chest tight with a familiar, complicated mixture of hurt and frustration. It should not have surprised her, this immediate shift from dismissal to opportunistic interest, and yet it stung nonetheless, this confirmation that even a moment of genuine connection had already been reduced, in her mother's eyes, to nothing more than a strategic advantage to be carefully cultivated. She spent the next hour avoiding further conversation, helping quietly with small tasks around the ballroom, refilling glasses and clearing empty plates, grateful for the simple, undemanding nature of such work. It was during this time that she noticed Julian across the room once more, engaged in conversation with several older gentlemen, his expression polite but distant, the same quiet formality she had observed earlier in the day before their walk in the gardens. She wondered, briefly, whether their conversation had meant as little to him as it had meant a great deal to her, whether men of his position simply passed such pleasant hours with countless young women at countless gatherings without a second thought once the evening concluded. The thought settled uncomfortably in her chest, and she busied herself further with her tasks, determined not to dwell on foolish hopes that could only lead to disappointment. But later, as the evening progressed toward its final hours, she felt a familiar presence beside her once more. "You have been avoiding me," Julian said quietly, his tone carrying a hint of gentle accusation. "I have simply been occupied with my duties," Elara replied, though she could not quite meet his eyes. "Your duties," he repeated. "I noticed your mother speaking with you rather intently earlier. I hope our conversation this afternoon has not caused you any difficulty." Elara hesitated, uncertain how much honesty was appropriate given the circumstances, but something in his steady, patient gaze encouraged her to speak plainly. "My family has spent my entire life considering me a disappointment, Your Grace. It is somewhat disorienting to suddenly find myself considered valuable, simply because you chose to speak with me this afternoon." Julian's expression grew serious, the earlier lightness of their garden conversation replaced by something more thoughtful. "I am sorry that my attention has complicated things for you. That was never my intention." "It is not your fault," Elara said quickly. "You have done nothing wrong. It is simply strange, to be seen as worthwhile only because of who noticed me, rather than because of anything I have actually done or said." "For what it is worth," Julian said, "I did not speak with you this afternoon because of any calculation or obligation. I spoke with you because our conversation was the most genuine exchange I have had in longer than I care to admit. That has nothing to do with your family's opinion of you, and everything to do with who you actually are." Elara looked up at him, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, but finding only quiet, steady honesty. "Why does that matter to you so much, Your Grace? Surely a man in your position has grown accustomed to genuine conversation being a rare commodity." "Precisely because it is so rare," he said. "Most people I encounter are either terrified of my title or entirely too eager to use it for their own advantage. You are neither. When you speak to me, I cannot help but believe you are speaking to the man rather than the position. Perhaps I simply have not yet learned proper manners," Elara said, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth despite herself. "Perhaps," Julian agreed, matching her smile with one of his own. "Though I confess, I find myself rather grateful for your lack of proper manners, Miss Whitmore." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the noise of the celebration continuing around them, before Julian spoke again, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I do not wish tonight to be the last time we speak, Elara. Might I have your permission to call upon you, once the wedding celebrations have concluded?" The request settled over her like something warm and unfamiliar, a possibility she had never once allowed herself to consider. "You wish to call upon me?" she repeated, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "I do," he said simply, "though I understand if such a request seems sudden, given how briefly we have known each other." "It does seem sudden," Elara admitted, "though I find I would very much like that, Your Grace." Something shifted in his expression at her answer, a warmth that softened the usual composed formality of his features, and for a brief moment, standing together at the edge of the crowded ballroom, Elara allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that perhaps her life was about to change in ways she had never dared to imagine. Their conversation was interrupted, as such moments often are, by the arrival of Serafina, radiant and slightly breathless from an evening of dancing and celebration, who approached with obvious curiosity about the man standing so attentively beside her younger sister. "Your Grace," Serafina said, offering a graceful curtsy, "I hope my sister has not been troubling you this evening." "On the contrary," Julian said smoothly, "your sister has been the most interesting company I have encountered at this entire celebration." Serafina's eyes widened slightly at the compliment, glancing between Julian and Elara with an expression of genuine surprise. It was, perhaps, the first time in years that anyone had described Alara using the word interesting rather than clumsy, and the novelty of it seemed to leave Serafina momentarily uncertain how to respond. "Well," Serafina said finally, recovering her composure, "I am glad to hear it, Your Grace. Alara has always been rather more thoughtful than the rest of us give her credit for." It was, Alara realized, the closest thing to a genuine compliment her sister had offered her in longer than she could remember, and though it came somewhat belatedly, prompted by the presence of a duke rather than any independent realization, she found herself grateful for it nonetheless. The evening drew toward its conclusion soon after, guests beginning to depart in their carriages, the ballroom gradually emptying of its earlier noise and energy. Julian remained until nearly the end, and as he finally prepared to take his leave, he found a private moment to speak with Alara once more near the entrance hall. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly. "I will call upon you soon. Alara Whitmore. I do not make such promises lightly." "I will look forward to it, Your Grace," she said, and as his carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, disappearing into the darkness beyond Whitmore Hall, Alara stood at the window of her small room beneath the eaves for a long while, watching the empty road, her heart filled with a cautious, fragile hope she had never before allowed herself to feel. She did not yet know how complicated the days ahead would become, how her family's newfound interest would test her patience, how her own doubts would rise to challenge the fragile connection she had formed with a man so far above her in station. But for that single, quiet night, standing at her window in the aftermath of her sister's wedding, Alara allowed herself simply to hope, and for the first time in years, hope did not feel like a foolish thing to hold on to. The days following the wedding brought a strange new rhythm to Whitmore Hall, one Alara found herself struggling to understand. Word of the Duke's attention had spread quickly through the extended family, carried from relative to relative with the same eager speed that gossip always seemed to travel. And by the third day after the wedding, it seemed there was hardly a person in the household who had not heard some version of the story, each retelling slightly more exaggerated than the last. "I heard he requested to call upon you specifically," Beatrice said one afternoon, finding Alara in the library where she had retreated with a book she had little intention of actually reading. "Is it true?" "He mentioned he might call, yes," Alara said carefully, unwilling to share more details than necessary with a cousin who had, only days earlier, mocked her mercilessly in front of strangers. "How extraordinary," Beatrice said, though her tone carried more calculation than genuine warmth. "Perhaps I misjudged you, Alara. I did not realize you possessed such hidden depths." Alara said nothing, returning her attention to her book, though she could feel Beatrice lingering nearby, clearly hoping for more information than Alara was willing to provide. It was a strange sensation, watching the very people who had spent years dismissing her suddenly reconsidering their opinions, not out of any genuine change of heart, but simply because a man of importance had shown her a moment of kindness. Her mother's behavior proved even more difficult to navigate. Lady Whitmore had transformed almost overnight, from a woman who barely tolerated her younger daughter's presence, into someone eager to discuss every detail of Alara's future, offering unsolicited advice about how best to secure the Duke's continued interest, which gowns might prove most flattering, which topics of conversation might best demonstrate Alara's suitability as a potential match. "You must not appear too eager," her mother advised one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, an arrangement that would have seemed unthinkable only a week earlier. "Men of his position value a certain restraint in a woman. You must be pleasant, of course, but not overly familiar." "Mother," Alara said, setting aside her needlework with visible frustration, "I have known the Duke for less than a week. I do not even know if he intends to call upon me at all, let alone whether he harbors any serious intentions toward me." "Nonsense," her mother said briskly. "A man does not request permission to call upon a young woman without serious intentions. You must simply be patient and allow things to unfold naturally." Alara wanted to point out the contradiction in her mother's advice, the insistence on both patience and careful strategy existing uncomfortably alongside each other, but she held her tongue, too tired to engage in an argument she knew she could not win. Instead, she excused herself early, retreating to her room, where she could at least find some peace from the constant, exhausting speculation that now seemed to surround her every moment. It was not only her family's sudden interest that troubled her, however. As the days passed without any word from Julian, Alara found herself increasingly plagued by doubts of her own making. She replayed their conversations endlessly in her mind, searching for any indication that his interest had been genuine, rather than simply a polite kindness extended to a socially awkward young woman he would likely never think of again. Perhaps, she told herself during one particularly restless night, he had simply been humoring her, offering kind words out of pity rather than any real regard for her character. Perhaps his promise to call upon her had been nothing more than the empty courtesy of a man too well-mannered to end a conversation abruptly, a promise he had no intention of ever fulfilling. The more she considered such possibilities, the more foolish she felt for having allowed herself even a moment of hope. She confided some of these doubts to Mrs. Fairweather, who remained at Whitmore Hall for several additional days after the wedding, to assist with the household's return to normalcy following the celebration. "You are allowing your fears to speak louder than your own good judgment," Mrs. Fairweather said gently, as they sat together in the quiet kitchen garden one afternoon. "I observed the two of you together, Alara. That was not the behavior of a man simply being polite."
"How can you be certain?"
Alara asked. "I have so little experience with such things. Perhaps I am simply misinterpreting ordinary courtesy as something more significant. I have been observing people for a great many years, my dear, and I have rarely seen a man look at a woman the way the Duke looked at you," Mrs. Fairweather said firmly. "Trust your own instincts a little more, and trust the doubts your family has instilled in you a little less." It was wise advice, Alara knew, but knowing something to be wise and finding the strength to actually follow it proved to be two entirely different matters. She continued to wait, her days filled with a strange, uncomfortable mixture of hope and anxiety, uncertain whether each passing day brought her closer to a promised visit or simply confirmed that she had, once again, been foolish enough to believe something too good to be true. 5 days after the wedding, a letter arrived at Whitmore Hall addressed specifically to Alara, sealed with an unfamiliar crest that sent the entire household into a flurry of speculation before Alara had even opened it. She retreated to her room to read it privately, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal. The letter was brief but warm, written in a confident, elegant hand. Julian apologized for the delay in writing, explaining that pressing matters concerning his estate had required his immediate attention in the days following the wedding, but he assured her that his intention to call upon her remained entirely unchanged. He would arrive at Whitmore Hall within the week, he wrote, and he looked forward, with genuine anticipation, to continuing the conversation they had begun in the gardens. Alara read the letter 3 times before allowing herself to fully believe its contents, a warmth spreading through her chest that she had rarely experienced in her entire life. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her notebook, alongside her sketches, a private treasure she had no intention of sharing with her family, at least not yet. But privacy proved difficult to maintain in a household as attentive to gossip as Whitmore Hall. Within hours, word had spread that a letter had arrived from the Duke, and by dinner that evening, the entire family seemed to be discussing little else. "You must show me exactly what he wrote," her mother insisted, though Alara firmly declined, unwilling to share something that felt, to her, deeply personal and precious. "It is a private letter, Mother," Alara said. "I will tell you only that he intends to call upon us within the week, as he previously mentioned." This announcement sent the household into an even greater frenzy of preparation, her mother immediately beginning to plan for the visit, with an intensity that reminded Alara uncomfortably of the wedding preparations only days earlier. New gowns were discussed, the drawing room was to be freshly arranged, and Alara found herself, once again, at the center of attention, for reasons that had little to do with anything she had actually done, and everything to do with the sudden, dizzying possibility that she might secure a match far beyond anything her family had ever imagined possible for their overlooked younger daughter. Amid all this chaos, Alara found herself increasingly uncertain about her own feelings. She genuinely enjoyed Julian's company, found herself thinking of their conversations with a warmth she had rarely experienced with anyone else, and yet the sudden transformation of her family's attitude toward her left her wondering whether any of this happiness could remain untainted by their eager calculations and expectations. She raised this concern with her father one evening, finding him alone in his study, surrounded by his usual ledgers and correspondence. "I do not know how to feel," she admitted, sitting across from him in the quiet room. "Everyone suddenly cares so much about my future, my prospects, my behavior, simply because a duke showed me some kindness. It feels as though none of it has anything to do with me at all." Her father set aside his papers, giving her his full attention, in a way he rarely did with anyone in the household. Your mother's excitement is not entirely without merit, Alara, though I understand why it troubles you. But I would encourage you to separate her expectations from your own feelings. What does your own heart tell you about this man? Alara considered the question carefully. I feel, when I am speaking with him, as though I am simply myself, without needing to apologize for anything. I have never felt that way with anyone before, certainly not within this family. Then hold on to that feeling, her father said, and let your mother's excitement exist separately from it. You are allowed to want this for yourself, Alara, regardless of what advantage it might bring to the rest of us. His words offered some measure of comfort, though the underlying tension within the household did not fully dissipate in the days that followed. Alara continued to wait for Julian's promised visit, her heart caught between genuine hope and the exhausting weight of her family's expectations, uncertain, still, exactly what the coming days would bring, but increasingly certain that whatever happened next, she wanted this particular hope, at least, to remain entirely her own. The Duke's carriage arrived at Whitmore Hall exactly 1 week after his letter had promised, and the entire household seemed to hold its breath as it rolled up the long gravel drive. Alara watched from her window, her heart pounding, with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness she had never before experienced, as Julian stepped down from the carriage, looking every bit as composed and elegant as he had at the wedding, though something in his expression, a slight eagerness, a warmth in his eyes as he glanced toward the house, suggested he was equally affected by the prospect of their reunion. Her mother had insisted on an elaborate arrangement for the visit, the drawing room freshly cleaned and decorated, refreshments prepared with far more care than usual, and Alara herself, dressed in one of the new gowns her mother had commissioned specifically for the occasion, a soft blue dress that fit her properly, for the first time in longer than she could remember, rather than the altered hand-me-downs she usually wore. You look lovely, her father said quietly as she made her way downstairs, and though the compliment was simple, it settled some of her nervousness before she entered the drawing room where Julian waited. He rose immediately upon her entrance, offering a bow that seemed, to Alara's eyes, more genuine than the formal courtesy such visits typically demanded. Miss Whitmore, he said, I am very glad to see you again. As am I, Your Grace, Alara replied, settling into the chair her mother had carefully arranged to face his, close enough for conversation, but proper enough to avoid impropriety. Her mother remained present for the visit, as etiquette required, though she positioned herself near the window, engaged in needlework that allowed her to observe without directly participating in the conversation. Alara found this arrangement somewhat easier than she had expected, her mother's presence a quiet reminder to maintain proper decorum, without interfering too directly in the natural flow of conversation between herself and Julian. They spoke, at first, of ordinary things, the weather, the journey from London, the general business of managing a large estate, but gradually, the conversation shifted toward more personal territory, each of them growing more comfortable as the visit progressed. Julian asked, as he had promised in the gardens, to see some of her sketches, and though Alara hesitated briefly, she eventually retrieved her notebook, offering it to him with trembling hands. He studied each drawing with genuine attention, lingering particularly over a sketch of birds gathered along the garden wall, his expression thoughtful and appreciative, rather than merely polite. These are remarkable, Alara, he said finally, using her given name for the first time, a small intimacy that did not go unnoticed by either of them. You have a genuine talent for capturing life in these small moments most people overlook entirely. They are only simple sketches, Alara said, though pleasure warmed her cheeks at his sincere praise. Simple sketches, created with genuine skill and feeling, Julian corrected gently. I have seen paintings hanging in grand galleries, with far less honesty in them than what you have captured here in a few pencil lines. Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, far longer than the typical duration for such visits, and by the time Julian finally rose to take his leave, Alara felt as though she had known him for years, rather than a single week. So easy and natural had their exchange become. I would like to call upon you again, if you would permit it, Julian said as he prepared to depart, and perhaps, in time, I might have the pleasure of introducing you to my sister. I believe she would find you every bit as remarkable as I have come to find you myself. I would like that very much, Alara said, and as his carriage disappeared once more down the long drive, She felt a warmth settle in her chest that she suspected would remain with her for the rest of the day, perhaps longer. This first visit proved to be only the beginning of a courtship that unfolded gradually over the following weeks, Julian returning to Whitmore Hall with increasing frequency, each visit deepening the connection between them in ways that Alara had never dared to imagine possible. He brought her books from London that he thought she might enjoy, engaged her in lengthy discussions about art and literature that no one else in her family had ever shown the slightest interest in, and gradually, patiently, drew out a confidence in her that had long been buried beneath years of family criticism. Word of the courtship spread quickly beyond the immediate family, reaching the wider social circles of the county, and Alara found herself, for the first time in her life, the subject of genuine curiosity, rather than mockery, whenever she attended local gatherings. It was a strange, disorienting shift, this sudden transformation from the family's overlooked disappointment into a young woman apparently worthy of a duke's serious attention, and Alara struggled, at times, to reconcile this new perception with the deep insecurities that years of unkindness had instilled within her. These insecurities surfaced most clearly during a garden party hosted by a neighboring family several weeks into the courtship, an event Julian attended specifically to accompany Alara, much to the visible astonishment of the assembled guests. As they walked together through the garden, Alara overheard a conversation between two women she barely recognized, their voices carrying just far enough for her to catch every word. "I simply cannot understand it," one woman said. "She is nothing remarkable to look at, and I have heard she is dreadfully clumsy. What could a man like the Duke possibly see in her?" "Perhaps he simply enjoys a novelty," the other replied. "Surely it cannot last. Men of his standing rarely settle for anything less than perfection." The words struck Alara with a familiar, painful sting, reawakening every doubt she had worked so hard to set aside over the past weeks. She excused herself from Julian's company shortly after, retreating to a quiet corner of the garden where she could compose herself away from prying eyes. Julian found her there several minutes later, his expression immediately concerned upon seeing her troubled state. "What has happened?" he asked gently. Alara hesitated, reluctant to share something so painful, but eventually the words spilled out. The overheard conversation, the doubts it had reawakened, the fear that perhaps their courtship truly was nothing more than a passing novelty that would eventually fade once he grew tired of her supposed imperfections. Julian listened with quiet patience, and when she finished, he took her hand gently, his expression serious and unwavering. "Alara, I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who value only appearances and reputation, who measure worth by wealth and social standing, rather than genuine character. I have grown tired of that world in ways I did not fully understand until I met you." "But what if they are right?" Alara asked, her voice trembling. "What if this is simply a novelty for you, something that will fade once the excitement wears away?" "Do you truly believe," Julian said, "that I would spend hours discussing literature and sketches with a woman I considered merely a passing novelty? Do you believe I would travel this distance, week after week, simply for entertainment?" He paused, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Alara, what I feel for you has nothing to do with fashion or fleeting interest. It has everything to do with the fact that you are the most genuine, thoughtful, and remarkable woman I have ever had the privilege of knowing." His words settled some of her fear, though not entirely, the years of accumulated doubt too deeply ingrained to disappear after a single conversation. But it was enough, in that moment, to allow her to return to the garden party with renewed composure, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm as they continued their walk together, indifferent now to the whispers that continued to follow them through the assembled guests. That evening, as she reflected on the day's events, Alara found herself considering, for the first time with genuine seriousness, the possibility that this courtship might lead somewhere far more permanent than she had previously allowed herself to imagine. The thought filled her with equal measures of hope and terror, hope for a future she had never dared to dream of, terror at the possibility that such happiness might yet prove too fragile to survive the doubts and judgments that continued to surround her at every turn. She did not yet know that within the coming weeks, an event would occur that would test the strength of Julian's affection far more severely than any garden party gossip ever could. An event that would force both of them to confront, publicly and unmistakably, exactly how deep their connection truly ran. The invitation arrived nearly 2 months after the wedding, a grand ball to be held at Ashbourne House in London, hosted by Julian's own family, to mark the end of the summer season. It was, Ilara understood immediately upon reading the elegant card, an event of considerable significance, one that would bring together the very heart of London society, including many who had never met her, and would judge her entirely on first impression. "You must attend," her mother insisted, the moment the invitation arrived. "This is precisely the kind of event where the Duke will wish to demonstrate his intentions publicly. You cannot possibly decline." Ilara felt the familiar tightness of anxiety settle in her chest at the prospect. A grand ball in London represented everything she feared most, an unfamiliar setting filled with unfamiliar people, all of them prepared to scrutinize her every movement, every word, every possible misstep. The wedding had been difficult enough, surrounded by relatives who already knew and mocked her particular flaws. A ball at Ashbourne House would place her before an entirely new audience, one with even less patience for imperfection. She confided her fears to Julian during his next visit, uncertain whether to accept the invitation at all. "I do not know if I can manage such an event," she admitted, sitting across from him in the familiar comfort of the Whitmore drawing room. "London society will not be as forgiving as my own family, and my own family has hardly been forgiving at all. You need not attend if it causes you such distress," Julian said gently, though something in his expression suggested he hoped for a different answer. "But I confess, I would very much like you to be there, Ilara. It would mean a great deal to me." She studied his face for a long moment, weighing her fear against her growing affection for him, and finally, despite every instinct urging caution, she agreed to attend. The weeks leading up to the ball passed in a blur of preparation. New gowns commissioned specifically for the occasion, dance lessons arranged in a desperate attempt to reduce the likelihood of embarrassment, and countless hours spent practicing proper etiquette under her mother's increasingly anxious supervision. Ilara approached each lesson with grim determination, though the old, familiar clumsiness continued to plague her at unexpected moments, her feet catching on rugs during dance practice, her hands trembling whenever the pressure of the upcoming event weighed too heavily on her mind. The night of the ball arrived with a mixture of dread and cautious excitement that left Ilara feeling almost ill as her carriage approached the grand entrance of Ashbourne House. The mansion, illuminated by hundreds of candles and lanterns, seemed impossibly grand, far beyond anything she had encountered even at her sister's wedding, and as she stepped through the entrance into a ballroom filled with London's most fashionable society, she felt smaller and more out of place than she had ever felt in her life. Julian found her almost immediately, his expression brightening with genuine warmth the moment he caught sight of her across the crowded room. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice as he approached. "I was not entirely certain you would." "I promised I would try," Ilara said, though her voice trembled slightly, as she took in the sheer scale and grandeur surrounding her. He introduced her to his sister, Lady Charlotte, a warm and welcoming woman who greeted Ilara with genuine kindness, rather than the cool assessment Ilara had feared. He introduced her, too, to various friends and acquaintances throughout the evening, each introduction accompanied by a quiet pride in his voice that gradually began to ease some of Ilara's overwhelming nervousness. But not everyone at the ball proved so welcoming. As the evening progressed, Ilara became increasingly aware of whispered conversations following her through the crowded rooms, comments about her modest background, her unremarkable family, the strangeness of the Duke's apparent interest in a woman so far beneath his usual social circle. She overheard, more than once, unkind speculation about how long such an unlikely match could possibly last, comments that reawakened every insecurity she had struggled to overcome throughout the summer. The moment she had dreaded most arrived during the third hour of the ball, as the musicians began a formal dance that required all guests present to participate, leaving Ilara with no reasonable excuse to avoid the dance floor entirely. Julian, sensing her rising panic, took her hand gently. "You need not do this if it frightens you," he said quietly, "but I promise, I will not let you fall." Ilara looked into his steady, reassuring gaze, and found, somewhere within herself, the courage to nod. They moved together onto the crowded dance floor, joining the other couples forming lines for the dance. And for the first several steps, Ilara managed remarkably well, her practiced lessons guiding her through the familiar movements with more grace than she had expected. But partway through the dance, as the pattern grew more complex, her foot caught against the hem of her gown, and she stumbled forward, momentarily losing her balance in full view of the entire assembled gathering. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of muffled laughter from somewhere within the crowd. Ilara felt her face burn with humiliation, certain that this moment would confirm every unkind whisper she had overheard throughout the evening, certain that Julian himself might finally recognize the truth his family and hers had always insisted upon, that she simply did not belong in a world such as this. But before she could fully fall, before the humiliation could fully consume her, Julian's arms steadied her instantly, his grip firm and sure, preventing her collapse entirely. Rather than releasing her, or stepping back in embarrassment, he laughed warmly, a genuine, unbothered sound that carried clearly across the surrounding silence. "Careful," he said, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, his tone carrying no trace of embarrassment or pity, only warm affection. "I did promise I would not let you fall." He steadied her fully, and rather than retreating from the dance floor in shame, he simply resumed the dance exactly where they had left off, his confident, unwavering support carrying them both through the remainder of the pattern, with an ease that gradually silenced the earlier laughter entirely. Ilara, startled by his reaction, found herself matching his composure, moving through the remaining steps of the dance with a newfound confidence, born not from perfect execution, but from the simple, powerful knowledge that the man beside her had not once considered her stumble a source of shame. By the time the dance concluded, the earlier whispers had faded almost entirely, replaced instead by a quiet, grudging respect from many of the guests who had witnessed the exchange. "You handled that beautifully," Julian said, as they stepped away from the dance floor, his hand still resting warmly against hers. "I nearly fell in front of half of London society," Ilara said, though a small, surprised laugh escaped her despite herself. "You did," Julian agreed, "and then you continued dancing anyway, with more grace and courage than most of the people in this room have ever shown in their entire lives. That, Ilara, is precisely why I care for you as deeply as I do." The words settled over her with a warmth that finally, fully silenced the doubts that had plagued her throughout the evening. She realized, standing there in the grand ballroom of Ashbourne House, surrounded by the very society she had feared would judge her most harshly, that Julian's affection had never depended on her perfection, had never wavered because of her occasional clumsiness, and would not, she now understood with complete certainty, fade simply because society whispered unkind things behind polished fans and painted smiles. The remainder of the evening passed far more easily than Ilara could have anticipated. Whether due to genuine reconsideration or simple curiosity, several guests approached her throughout the following hours, engaging her in conversation with newfound interest, some even complimenting the quiet composure she had shown during her earlier stumble. By the time her carriage finally departed Ashbourne House late that night, Ilara felt something she had rarely experienced in all her years of enduring her family's unkindness: genuine, unshakable pride in herself, earned not through perfection, but through resilience. As the carriage rolled through the darkened streets of London toward her temporary lodgings, Ilara allowed herself, finally, to believe fully in the possibility that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. Julian Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, had looked at her stumble, at her imperfection, at the very flaw her family had mocked relentlessly for years, and had found in it not embarrassment, but reason for deeper affection. It was, she realized, the first time in her entire life that her clumsiness had been met with laughter instead of scorn, warmth instead of shame, and she suspected, as her carriage carried her through the quiet London night, that such a change marked the true beginning of everything that was still to come. News of the ball spread quickly through both London society and the quieter circles of Whitmore Hall, though the story that traveled proved remarkably different from the humiliation Ilara had originally feared. Rather than becoming known as the clumsy young woman who had stumbled before all of London's finest families, she found herself instead the subject of admiring conversation, praised for her composure and quiet dignity, in the face of an embarrassing moment that would have undone many women far more socially confident than herself. Her mother, upon hearing the full account from a relative who had attended the ball, could hardly contain her excitement. "The Duke defended you before all of London society," Lady Whitmore said, practically breathless with satisfaction. "Ilara, do you understand what this means? This is no longer simply a passing courtship. This is a serious and public declaration." Ilara, though pleased by the evening's outcome, felt a familiar discomfort at her mother's continued focus on advantage and reputation, rather than any genuine happiness for her daughter's personal contentment. But she said nothing, too weary from the accumulated tension of recent months to engage in yet another argument that would likely change nothing. In the weeks that followed the ball, Julian's visits to Whitmore Hall grew even more frequent, and the nature of their conversations shifted gradually toward matters of a more serious and permanent nature. He spoke, with increasing openness, of his hopes for the future, of the estate he managed, of the responsibilities that awaited whichever woman eventually became his wife, and Alara found herself, with growing confidence, imagining a life alongside him that had once seemed entirely beyond her reach. It was during one such visit, on a crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 3 months after the wedding that had first brought them together, that Julian requested a private walk in the same gardens where their connection had first begun. Alara agreed readily, sensing something significant in his unusually solemn demeanor as they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes before Julian finally spoke, his voice carrying a rare nervousness that Alara had never before witnessed in the otherwise composed and confident Duke. "Alara," he began, "I have spent a great deal of time since we first met considering exactly what it is I wish for my future. I have attended countless gatherings over the years, met countless women considered suitable matches for a man of my position, and never once, in all that time, did I encounter anyone who made me feel as genuinely myself as I feel whenever I am in your company." Alara's heart began to race, sensing the direction of his words even before he continued. "You have taught me," he said, "that true grace has nothing to do with perfect movements or flawless manners, and everything to do with honesty, resilience, and genuine kindness, qualities you possess in greater measure than anyone I have ever known. I do not wish to spend another season attending balls and courting proper young women who bore me within minutes of conversation. I wish to spend my life with you, Alara, exactly as you are, stumbles and all." He knelt then, right there in the quiet garden where they had first spoken beside the old oak tree, and asked her, with quiet sincerity, to become his wife. Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes, tears of a happiness so complete and unexpected that she could hardly find the words to respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with emotion. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Julian, I would be honored to become your wife." He rose and embraced her warmly, and for a long, quiet moment, they simply stood together beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where Alara had once sat alone, mocked and dismissed by her own family, now standing in that very spot as the future Duchess of Ashbourne, chosen not despite her flaws, but because of the genuine character those flaws had helped reveal. When they returned to the house to share the news, the reaction from Alara's family proved exactly as complicated as she had anticipated. Her mother's excitement bordered on overwhelming, immediately beginning to plan for a wedding of even grander scale than Serafina's own celebration, already imagining the social advantages such a connection would bring to the entire family. Aunt Margaret and Beatrice, who had mocked Alara relentlessly only months earlier, suddenly discovered a newfound warmth toward their previously overlooked relative, their earlier cruelty apparently forgotten entirely in the face of such an advantageous match. Alara observed these reactions with a mixture of amusement and quiet resignation. She had learned, over the difficult months since her sister's wedding, that some people would never truly change their fundamental character, regardless of circumstances. Her mother would likely always value advantage and reputation above genuine understanding, and relatives like Beatrice would likely always adjust their opinions based on convenience, rather than any authentic reconsideration of their previous unkindness. But not everyone's reaction proved so complicated. Her father embraced her warmly, genuine tears of happiness in his eyes, as he offered his heartfelt congratulations. "I always knew you were remarkable, Alara," he said quietly. "I am simply glad the rest of the world has finally begun to see it too." Serafina, too, offered her congratulations, with what appeared to be genuine warmth, embracing her younger sister with an affection that had grown gradually more sincere throughout the months since her own wedding. "I am truly happy for you," she said. "You deserve this happiness, Alara, more than anyone I know." Mrs. Fairweather, upon receiving the news through a letter Alara sent personally, replied with characteristic wisdom and warmth. She wrote that she had recognized, from the very beginning, the genuine connection forming between Alara and the Duke, and expressed her deep joy that Alara had finally found someone capable of seeing her true worth, exactly as she was. The wedding itself, held the following spring at Ashbourne House, proved to be an event of considerable grandeur, attended by members of London's most prominent families, alongside Alara's own relatives from Whitmore Hall. Alara walked down the aisle in a gown of her own careful design, incorporating small embroidered birds along the hem, a quiet, personal touch that only she and Julian fully understood the significance of. As she exchanged vows with Julian before their assembled families and friends, Alara found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young woman mocked relentlessly for her clumsiness and awkwardness, dismissed by her own family as a lifelong disappointment, to a woman standing confidently before the very people who had once dismissed her, about to become the Duchess of Ashbourne, chosen precisely because of the qualities they had once considered her greatest flaws. The reception that followed proved joyful and warm, filled with genuine celebration, rather than the careful calculation that had characterized so much of Alara's earlier interactions with society. She danced with Julian throughout the evening, no longer fearful of stumbling before watching eyes, understanding now that even her occasional missteps would be met with warmth and laughter, rather than scorn, at least from the one person whose opinion had truly come to matter most. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, Julian drew her aside to a quiet corner of the ballroom, echoing the very first private conversation they had shared at her sister's wedding nearly a year earlier. "Do you remember," he asked, "what I told you the very first time we spoke, on the terrace at your sister's wedding? You told me you found the broken plate more interesting than anything else that had happened that day," Alara said, smiling at the memory. "I meant it entirely," Julian said. "From that very first moment, I saw something in you that no one else in that room seemed capable of recognizing. I am endlessly grateful that circumstances brought us together that day, and even more grateful that you agreed to share your life with me." Alara looked around the grand ballroom, filled with people who had once mocked her mercilessly, and now celebrated her happiness with genuine warmth, whether from true reconsideration or simple opportunism, and found that she no longer needed their approval to feel complete. She had found, in Julian, someone who valued her exactly as she was, someone who had looked past every flaw her family had once used to define her, and had seen instead a woman worthy of genuine love and respect. As the final dance of the evening began, Alara moved into Julian's arms without hesitation, her earlier fear of stumbling replaced entirely by quiet confidence. She missed a step partway through the dance, exactly as she often did, and rather than freezing in embarrassment or waiting for laughter, she simply laughed along with Julian, who steadied her instantly, exactly as he always did, and continued the dance without missing a beat. The people who had once mocked her as clumsy and graceless had, in the end, never truly understood her worth at all. It had taken a duke, a man who valued authenticity over perfection, honesty over polished manners, to finally see what had been there all along. A woman of genuine character, resilience, and quiet strength, waiting patiently for someone capable of looking closely enough to notice. A year passed since the wedding at Ashbourne House, and life as the Duchess of Ashbourne brought Alara far more contentment than she had ever imagined possible during her lonely years at Whitmore Hall. She had settled into her new role gradually, learning to manage a grand household with the same quiet determination she had once used simply to survive her family's constant criticism. And though she never became a woman of effortless, natural grace, she discovered something far more valuable along the way: genuine confidence in her own worth. Her drawings, once hidden away in a private notebook shown to no one outside her closest confidants, gradually found a wider audience. Julian, proud of her talent, encouraged her to share her sketches more openly, and what began as a private hobby slowly transformed into something Alara pursued with genuine purpose. She filled entire notebooks with drawings of the estate's gardens, the birds that gathered along its ancient stone walls, quiet moments of everyday life that most people rushed past without a second glance. Several of her sketches eventually found their way into a small, privately printed collection, shared among friends and family, earning genuine admiration from people who had once known her only as the awkward, overlooked younger sister. Her relationship with her own family evolved slowly over that first year, complicated by the same underlying tensions that had always existed, though tempered now by distance and, occasionally, genuine reconciliation. Her mother visited Ashbourne House several times, her behavior a curious mixture of genuine pride and lingering calculation, forever eager to mention her daughter's elevated status to anyone who would listen, though rarely offering the deeper emotional connection Alara had always privately hoped for. Alara had learned, with time, to accept this complicated relationship for what it was, extending polite warmth, without expecting the kind of unconditional acceptance she had found instead, in Julian, and in the small circle of true friends, who valued her for who she actually was. Serafina's friendship, by contrast, deepened considerably during that first year, the sisters exchanging frequent letters and visiting each other whenever their respective households allowed. Serafina, now expecting her first child, often wrote to Alara seeking advice and comfort, and Alara found genuine joy in offering the same kindness and support to her sister that she had so rarely received during their shared childhood. Whatever distance and unkindness had once existed between them gradually softened into something resembling true sisterly affection, forged not through obligation, but through mutual respect that had grown alongside both their lives. Mrs. Fairweather remained a treasured correspondent and occasional visitor throughout that first year, her wisdom and warmth continuing to offer Alara guidance whenever the pressures of her new position grew overwhelming. It was Mrs. Fairweather who reminded her, during a particularly difficult visit from extended relatives, eager to discuss the family's improved social standing, that genuine happiness came not from the approval of others, but from remaining true to one's own character, regardless of circumstance. Julian, for his part, proved himself, day after day, exactly the man Alara had glimpsed during their very first conversation on the terrace at her sister's wedding. He continued to value her honesty above polished manners, her genuine character above effortless grace, and their marriage grew steadily stronger as they navigated the challenges of their new life together, supporting each other through difficult decisions concerning the estate, through the occasional social gathering where old prejudices about Alara's background still lingered among certain unforgiving members of society, and through the quiet, ordinary moments of everyday life that ultimately mattered far more than any grand ballroom or public celebration ever could. There remained, of course, occasional reminders of the years of unkindness that had shaped so much of Alara's early life. At a gathering nearly a year after their marriage, she overheard a distant acquaintance remark, with obvious surprise, that the Duchess of Ashbourne seemed remarkably ordinary for a woman married to such a distinguished duke. Once, such words would have crushed her entirely, sending her retreating into familiar shame and self-doubt. Instead, she simply smiled, genuinely unbothered, and continued her conversation with the friends gathered around her, understanding now, with complete certainty, that her worth had never depended on meeting the narrow expectations of people who valued only surface appearances. Julian, overhearing the remark from across the room, later shared with her his own quiet amusement at such comments. "They still do not understand," he said, holding her close as they prepared for bed one evening. "They see only what you are not, rather than everything remarkable that you are." "Let them think what they wish," Alara replied, resting her head against his shoulder with the easy comfort of a woman who had finally, fully found her place in the world. "I know my own worth now, regardless of what anyone else chooses to believe." As the second year of their marriage began, Alara discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled both her and Julian with quiet, profound joy. She often thought during the long months of anticipation about the kind of mother she hoped to become, determined that any child of hers would grow up knowing, from the very beginning, that their worth had nothing to do with grace or perfection, and everything to do with honesty, kindness, and genuine character. She thought, too, occasionally, of the frightened, overlooked young woman who had once sat alone beneath an old oak tree, mocked by her own family, believing herself destined for a lifetime of quiet disappointment. That young woman could never have imagined the life that awaited her, could never have believed that her greatest perceived flaw, her clumsiness, her inability to move through the world with effortless grace, would ultimately become the very quality that drew the genuine love of a man capable of seeing past surface perfection to something far more valuable underneath. The people who had mocked her at her sister's wedding, who had spent years dismissing her as clumsy and graceless, had never truly understood what they were looking at. They had seen only stumbles and broken dishes, awkward silences and missed steps, and had judged her worth entirely by these small, insignificant failures. They had never once paused to notice her quiet resilience, her genuine kindness, her sharp intelligence, or the remarkable strength it took to endure years of unkindness without ever losing her fundamental goodness. It had taken a duke, a man capable of looking beyond society's narrow expectations, to finally see what had been there all along. And in seeing her clearly, fully, and completely, Julian Ashbourne had given Alara something far more valuable than a title or a grand estate. He had given her the certainty, at long last, that she had never truly been graceless at all. She had simply been waiting, patiently and quietly, for someone with the wisdom to look closely enough to notice her true and lasting grace.